Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Cop Talk. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jeff Coons, and I am a captain with the Keizer Police Department. And today I have a new guest with me, somebody who has not appeared on Cop Talk before, but we have worked for several years together. I'd like to welcome Sergeant Bob Trump to the set here today. So, Bob, because our viewers haven't seen you before, they've probably seen you out on patrol over the years. You've been with the Keizer Police Department for quite some time. Let's take just a few minutes to talk about you and how long you've worked for the agency and let the viewers at least know what your credentials are. So how long have you worked for Keizer PD?
I've gone on 18 years. During that time, I've worked in the patrol division as a patrol officer, worked as a detective, worked as a traffic officer as well, patrol sergeant, and most recently I am a detective sergeant in charge of the crew, the community response unit, and also a defensive tactics coordinator and instructor.
So the viewers and the taxpayers have spent a lot of money on Bob Trump to train you and to get you into the position that you're in today, and you are a highly respected and specialized trainer for the police department. You've been training in defensive tactics and use of force our troops or our officers for approximately how many years now?
Approximately about 6 years.
Yeah, so in that, and let's talk about that, because that is going to be the topic of discussion today, is I've asked Sergeant Trump to come on to talk about use of force, because it is one of those things that when a police department has to use force, especially deadly physical force, oftentimes it catches the headlines. It's all over the news, especially when some of these instances end tragically with the death of the suspect. So one of the things I wanted to do by inviting you on was to talk about force and the options that the officers have. But before doing that, can you explain to the viewers how often you train, how often you personally train, how many classes we send you to, just to keep you current in case law, etc.?
Instructors, usually we attend some sort of a use of force update, a legal update, current training out in the field by experts really from nationwide. We attend their courses. We receive the most up-to-date training. In terms of our police officers back here, we like to train our police officers about 5 times per year. That's about 3 times for the confrontational simulation program, which allows officers to engage in real-life encounters with role players, and about 2 times a year for defensive tactics training, which allows them to actually practice different techniques, rolling around the mats, defending themselves, using properly administered tactics so that the right outcome comes out. So that basically the police officers are safer out in the community and the citizens are safer as well.
Yeah, and we'll touch on those. I got a nice little outline here. We will talk about CONSIM, because the viewers are sitting at home right now saying, well, what's CONSIM and simulations and simunitions and all that. So we're going to touch on that a little bit. But one of my roles as the host of Cop Talk and a captain of the Keizer Police Department is to enforce the policy of the Keizer Police Department. And one of the policies is with regard to use of force. And we have a policy that says that there shall be a community education piece when it comes to use of force. So that's what we're trying to accomplish today. Is to help educate our viewers as to different force options, the amount of training that goes into it, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just read to you the policy that we're covering today. It says that the department shall offer community education regarding the elements of this policy, that meaning our use of force policy, and the elements of the law enforcement use of deadly physical force response plan. This shall occur at least annually and may be accomplished a number of ways. For example, discussing the information in a community self-defense class, providing a presentation on a local community broadcast cable channel, that's Keizer 23, and or combining with other agencies to host a community forum dedicated to this topic. And I want to assure you that community forum, thanks to Senate Bill 111, does occur. It does occur annually, and it's generally hosted by the Marion County Sheriff's Office. So just pay attention to your local media outlets, your local newspapers, and if you're interested in learning more about this topic, look for those Senate Bill 111 community forums, and they're open to the public, and they're generally held out at the DPSST Academy out there on the Almsville Highway. So with kind of our introductions out of the way and everybody knowing that you've worked for us for 18 years, which is a long time, and kind of what your field of expertise is. And it really, truly is a field of expertise. This use of force is something that the Keizer Police Department treats very seriously, and rightfully so. There are a lot of course, liabilities that come when our officers choose or have to use force. So we're well aware of that. So with that, Sergeant Trump, let's talk about a little bit about the options that police officers have. We have a duty belt, and then there's a lot of gear on that, but let's talk about the options that officers have when it comes to using force.
You betcha. Basically, the first option police officers have is their presence. When they arrive on scene, they're basically the power sort of vested in them to do their job by the uniform and the badge that they wear. The next stage of police contact is their verbal skills. Officers, a lot of times we use persuasion to gain compliance or to basically administer what we do for our job. The next stage, basically, or level, is physical contact, and that can be just a simple escort hold or a little sort of what we call a come-along technique to get people to comply.
Right.
As it escalates past that, police officers sometimes have to use physical control, and those are more like pressure point manipulation. It just becomes a little bit more hands-on type scenario.
Wrist locks, arm locks.
Exactly.
More serious control holds.
It's a little bit stepped up in terms of control.
Okay.
And the next phase would be, or level would be, serious physical control. And those are the things like impact weapons, canine bites, taser deployment, baton strikes, those sort of things.
Let's talk about, so we just talked about the police belt. So it's more than the belt. It's my mere presence that there is an expectation that when a police officer arrives on whatever scene he or her has been dispatched to, that when an officer shows up, they're wearing a uniform, they're displaying a badge. There is some type of expectation that things, whatever was occurring, will cease to occur, whether it was a fight or what have you. And then if it doesn't occur, just simply by the police officer inserting him or herself into that scene, then we have our verbal commands. Hey, stop doing that. Hey, put the bat down. Hey, drop the gun. Hey, stop assaulting that individual. And then after that, if the person doesn't listen or isn't following our commands, then we can escalate the use of force.
Yeah, that's right.
But in sometimes back when I was trained, and we talked about this a little bit earlier before beginning to record here today. We actually called this the use of force continuum. And we were basically trained, and I think the public, and one of the reasons why we're doing the program, has a belief that an officer has to try every option that they have available to themselves before they can resort to, unfortunately, the use of deadly force in some circumstances. So touch on that a little bit. Are we following the continuum anymore, or what have the courts said?
Well, generally speaking, we do not follow a continuum. The continuum that I sort of outlined has to do with 6 different steps, ultimately resulting in deadly physical force being at the top of that threshold. The problem with that is that there are a lot of rungs, so to speak, if you're looking at it like a ladder, that an officer would have to go through. But there are those scenarios where a police officer would go from arriving on a scene to immediately employing deadly physical force if that's what was necessary and reasonable at the time. And so there are a lot of steps in between that weren't followed necessarily. And so the reason we have moved away from that, and we just go to basically it's like a wheel, and the police officer's in between, in the middle. The police officer can decide whichever force seems reasonable at the time, depending on the facts and circumstances. Basically, the courts have ruled that use of force situations and incidents are rapidly evolving. They're tense, they're uncertain, and police officers must make split-second decisions in those environments. And so that's why the police officers need a wide array of different force options available to them.
And you are the guy that gets to read all those court opinions, and some of them are quite lengthy.
Yes, they are.
Recently, of course, the majority of them that we're seeing in the law enforcement world pertain to tasers.
Yes.
That's the newest tool that we have on our tool belt. So there's obviously a lot of attention being given to tasers. And you touched on it earlier. You touched about how many times we train, but I wanted to delve into that a little bit further. So How often do we train in the use of force? And let's talk about the different ways that we train, whether it be in the classroom giving legal updates and new information versus actually going hands-on. Let's pull back the three different areas that I'm thinking about and tell the viewers just how much time we spend in this area.
Well, it's an important topic. I mean, police officers, really, all law enforcement officers are really expected to really understand and know when to apply use of force, and these are complicated issues. Every situation is different. There is zero cookie cutter scenarios, or zero cookie cutter scenarios where police officers fit every mold every time. So because of that, our training has to be varied as well. We, at least twice a year, we will update our use of force applicability in terms of the law. Any case law updates, give a legal update. Police officers are tested on that material. They're expected to show some proficiency. And also in conjunction with that, a couple times a year we practice, again, mat work, practicing the actual maneuvers and the techniques that we teach police officers from everything from, again, our presence and our tactical considerations of how we respond to a call to the nuts and bolts of handcuffing individuals to joint manipulations, taser deployment, how to deploy a taser with multiple police officers so that it's safe to do so and to minimize risk of injury to the police officers, the suspect who we're dealing with, and also the general public. So we have those areas. And in addition to those trainings, we also have confrontational simulation. Confrontational simulation is where police officers sort of don an outfit that protects them from a paintball marker cartridge that's fired from authentic feeling and operational weapons that only fire, they're especially made to only fire those marking cartridges. So police officers can have real life training in the field of how to use those guns, how to confront different various situations out there in the field, and then survive those. And again, with minimal injuries to themselves, other police officers, the suspect, and the public. And then in addition to those areas, we also train in the range a couple times where police officers fire their actual duty service weapons, the rifles, the less lethal beanbag rounds, which have also been a tool in that same category as using a baton, can be used to subdue suspects when that need arises.
You obviously prepared for this show, didn't you? You have a lot of information that's just, I'm going to slow you down a little bit. So we talked about the classroom, which we do at least 2 times a year, and I just wanted to reiterate, in case the viewers didn't hear it, we actually test our officers. So Sergeant Trump, and we have other instructors, they'll come in and they will give an update. And a good example is we just recently went through this training, and the 9th U.S. Circuit Court came out with recently or within the last year or so that says, thou shalt attempt to give, if feasible, a verbal warning before you deploy or use a taser on somebody. When we first had tasers 5 or 6 years ago, that wasn't anything the officers had to consider. But after many tasings and many lawsuits, the 9th U.S. Circuit has now come out and said you have to consider a whole bunch of variables, the severity of the crime, etc., and you must, if feasible, attempt to give a verbal warning. So these are the types of things that we entrust in you as an instructor, that not only are you running our criminal investigations unit and all the daily follow-up investigations that need to be done, but we also task you with the additional responsibility of tracking these cases and working with the courts and reading opinions and making sure that our officers are very knowledgeable. And that's no easy task. So kudos to you for doing that.
Appreciate that.
And then you talked about the actual going hands-on. So once the classroom portion is complete and we take a test and we successfully pass that test, and believe me, it's not a 2 or 3 question true or false answer test. It's generally 20 to 25 very important questions that we ask the officers to make sure they know and understand when and where they can use force. After that, we do practical exercises. And I think one of the greatest ones that's come along in the last few years is ConSim. And you touched on it briefly, but basically let's talk about ConSim. And some of the viewers may have seen us throughout the city. I call it the top of the hill, or down there by McNary. We've used the barn that sits on top of the field that's now vacant for many of our scenarios. But let's talk about that. What are what are we trying to learn and impress upon the officers when we run them through scenario training?
Well, the bottom line with the scenario training is that your body won't ever go, in our opinion, where your mind hasn't already been. And so what we want to do is we want to basically train police officers how to win scenarios out there, whether it's a scenario that involves them controlling the environment through their verbal skills, their presence, through coordinating with backup officers and making contingency plans, or whether it really involves either the display or actual use of deadly force implements. Most police officers will never be involved in a shooting in their lives. CONSIM basically gives police officers that opportunity to train in that environment and to be involved in a shooting situation where they're able to move to cover, they're able to protect themselves, to properly and legally, justifiably apply deadly physical force in an environment where it's safe, where if there are errors that are made, we can press a rewind button, something police officers never have the opportunity to do in the real field. And it just gives them a chance to go through scenarios and win those scenarios and do the right, proper outcome.
Yeah, I think it's some of the, and in the rounds that we put into the guns are not cheap, and so we have a good training budget, but so we use those, and I personally, in my 21 years of law enforcement, I think it's some of the best training that we've ever had. Like you said, if you have a jam in your gun, it teaches you to work through the problem at hand while still giving the suspect verbal commands, while looking for cover or concealment. It's just some of the best training. So the viewers, when you're around town, if you happen to see Keizer PD training signs that have been erected along the roadside, and you see officers running around with masks covering their face, etc., that's generally what we're doing, because we try to do that. Most of the time we can accomplish that while the officers are on duty without an overtime expense. And we're trying to run 38 officers through different situations, so they can do, like you said, the mind won't go where the body hasn't been before, or vice versa. I think I got that right. But it's fabulous training, and I know our officers appreciate it. So let's move on to what factors officers need to consider before using any amount of force. Are there certain factors that he or she must consider?
Absolutely. There are basically three pillars of factors, and one of them is the severity of the crime. We want our police officers to consider what type of crime we're dealing with to begin with and where we're using force. Very minor infractions of the law, driving type infractions. If that's all that we're talking about in the scenario, we want officers to consider that, because the severity of the crime is a big factor. The second one is whether the suspect poses an immediate threat. The courts have ruled that immediate threat means just that. Is the suspect passive? Is he threatening to be a threat, but he has no means or ability to carry that threat out? The courts have asked that we be able to establish it before applying force that the suspect's an immediate threat.
So let me just interject. So if somebody is telling me, or one of our officers, they're going to kill me, however they're wearing a swimsuit or a pair of shorts, and I can see that he or she has no weapon, no means, no knife, no gun, no club, no bat, no broken beer bottle, then they don't have the means to kill me.
That's exactly right.
So I have to look at that situation a little bit differently, and just because they say they're going to kill me, I got to look at the totality of the circumstances.
Absolutely, and that's just the point, is that the police officer needs to be able to assess, articulate both verbally in court, because these are highly litigated, in our litigious society that we all live in. These are highly litigated cases. There's almost certainly going to be at least criminal charges. And then on to the civil portions and so forth. The third leg or pillar of that, the concerns that police officers use to assess levels of force, is whether the suspect is actively resisting or attempting to evade arrest by flight. In other words, are they running away? Are they actively resisting? And those are the three things that we look at as police officers in determining whether justified use of force is applicable or not.
Very well said. Well, I wanted to wrap up here today and just let the viewers know we're going to cover a couple things, but part of doing this program is to remind the viewers that the Keizer Police Department is truly an open book. We document. We have a policy that if an officer uses force, they must document it using a use of force report form. And at the end of the year, we complete a use of force annual report. And I think sometimes police agencies can get a bad name or be accused of using excessive use of force or using force too often. And I wanted to use the last 3 or 4 minutes here just to touch upon some of the highlights that are in this report. And I think that you would find them interesting. I know you know them, but the viewers don't. But an example is in 2008, so a couple years ago, the Keizer Police Department responded to 13,576 calls for service. Of those 13,000 calls for service, we made 3,037 arrests. So out of the 36,000 people that live in Keizer, we made just over 3,000 arrests that year. Out of the 13,000 calls for service, force was only used in 106 of them. So that is 3.49% of the calls for service amounted or equaled or had some force used. And that could be as simple as a wrist lock all the way up to a baton strike or pepper spray. So
Pretty small numbers.
yeah, pretty small numbers. So continuing, last year, 2009, we responded to 12,395 calls for service, and we had 2,079 arrests. In those, we had fewer uses of force. We only had 81 use of force incidents, and that equates to 3.89% of the time we respond on a call that we actually use force. So some people might believe that 20, 25%, maybe 30 or 40% of the calls we respond on end up in some type of use of force situation, and that is just, I'm here to dispel the myth that that's just simply not true. Some other interesting data that comes out of this that the viewers might find interesting is Saturdays are the most likely day the Keizer Police Department will use force. And force is most often used between the hours of 8 p.m. and 1 a.m. And males are the most likely person that we are going to use force against. Last year we used force against 67 males and 14 females, so that gives you the total of 81. And the most likely age group that we are going to use force against is the age group of 20 to 29 years of age. And the highest, this is interesting, but well, probably not interesting, but most times the Keizer police officer has to use force against somebody, it's because that individual refused to follow their orders. It wasn't because they were holding a bat above their head, threatening to strike or harm one of our officers. It was simply because they wouldn't take their hands out of the pocket. The officer thought he or she may have a weapon. They refused to turn around and put their hands behind their back, so we had to use a control hold or what have you. But basically, when I read the reports, I say if people would just listen to the police officers when they show up and the lawful orders that we're given to them, we wouldn't have to use any force, let alone 3 or 4% that we use on all these calls that we go on. So I find those numbers real interesting, and we compile these reports on a yearly basis. They are on our webpage at www.keizerpd.com. The 2010 report will be out shortly because we wait through December of that year to finish it. And these are available to the public. We use them. We learn from them. We train our officers using this data. And I just thought that you would find that interesting. So with that being said, Sergeant Trump, before we wrap up, I just wondered if you had any closing comments or any knowledge that you wanted to embark on our viewers today.
No, just to say that use of force is a serious topic. It's something that we take very seriously here in our training program at the Keizer Police Department, and our police officers use very professional, correct amount of force, reasonable force throughout the year, and that's what that use of force report shows. Shows that we use professionally appropriate uses of force, and our police officers are well trained. They do a really good job.
I should add on that all those reports, they're all routed to you too. Not only does the chief of police and myself and the lieutenants review every incident where force was used. That's part of our job. But we do share all those reports with you, so you can go through them, review them, and actually many of our training scenarios come from actual Keizer incidents, and then some that you, the viewers, might see on a national basis. You and your group of trainers will use those as scenarios in the future and train our officers to just continually make our officers better and better at the job that we're asked to do out there every day. So I certainly appreciate you coming on the show today, and as always, If you have questions, the telephone number is on your screen there, and of course you can go to our website. And of course, if you ever have any complaints about a Keizer officer, that's something that I get a look into, and the chief. So if you have complaints, make sure that you call in. We look at each and every one of those, and like the sergeant said, we do take the use of force very seriously here at the Keizer Police Department. We hope that you've learned something from the program today, and we always appreciate you watching. And until next time, we'll see you again on another edition of Cop Talk. Thank you.